Thank you thank you for coming again. This time we're going to discuss your project Bal'ua. You're part of the old project Bal'ua near Karak. And what we know about the site? Is it the site from the Iron Age or even older site?
Right. Thanks for having me back. So, yeah, I can tell you a bit. Maybe I'll start a bit actually by just talking about the project and then a bit about what we know about the site. And we can go from there. So, the project I'm working with, actually wrapping them today, is the Bal'ua Regional Archaeology Project,
Yeah.
based out of a number of institutions, but primarily La Sierra University in Riverside here in California, and Sarmenti Grotti and Free Britanino. And I'll talk a little bit about their interest in the site once, once I tell you what we know about the sites. But I am one of the field directors of the project in the Islamic village. So that's kind of where I'll focus. The site has actually been known for quite a while. So Crowfoot excavated there in the 1930s. And one of the things that was found during the sort of initial investigations of the site was, well, this thing on my shirt, the Bal'ua stela. The original is in the Jordan Museum, so if viewers have been to the Jordan Museum, they might have seen the Bal'ua stela at some points. But it's kind of an interesting stela in that it seems to date the late Bronze Age, which is a period of occupation that's represented at the site. It's represented at the site in the Bal'ua stela, but isn't really the primary period of occupation that visitors actually see when they come to the site. Um, One of the unique things about the site, on one hand, one of the unique things about the site is that it's enormous for the area. I mean, as you can see on the slide that you have up now, it's many hectares. The site is about like 20 hectares, which is quite spread out. And in the northern and eastern parts of the site, basically the part that sort of stretches along Wadi al Balua in the north of the site, a lot of the standing architecture actually dates to the Iron Age. So, from the perspective of the site directors and a lot of the people who are working in that main part of the site, it's sort of an interesting opportunity to investigate an Iron Age site because a lot of the Iron Age remains are just right on the surface. They're interspersed with other stuff. There's Nabatean remains and Hellenistic remains. There's probably some Byzantine as well, but for the most part, you kind of get a sense of the outlines of the Iron Age settlements right away. And actually, one of the major things that the team is investigating right now, called the Kosser, which is, well, probably some sort of royal structure. It's, I don't think, entirely clear what it is yet, although that's also not my part of the site. But that is actually the structure where the Bal'ua stela was found and where Crowfoot conducted his excavations in the 1930s. You mentioned, though, the possibility of earlier remains. That is something that the team is working on as well. When Udo Vorschek dug at the sites in the 1980s and 1990s before Friedrich now took over as director, um, he had gotten down to levels that seem to date to the early Bronze Age. And it seems like in the project that we're working on now, we're encountering residual pottery that dates as early as the early Bronze Age as well, with a lot of the other parts of the Bronze Age in between. The part of the site that I'm interested in is part of the site that, if you're sort of looking at the map of the site, is basically concentrated in the southwestern corner. I realize now that that's backwards. It would be over here if we were looking at a map on my screen. And that is kind of interesting because the standing remains seem primarily to date to the Islamic period. In particular, they seem fairly typical of the middle and late Islamic periods. In Jordan, that's basically the period after 1000 AD. Um, and a lot of the standing architecture has parallels in other sites of the same period on the Karak Plateau. So, for example, we have these houses, and essentially they're sort of these rectangular houses with vaults springing from either sort of exterior wall, the long walls on the sides, generally called barrel vaulted houses, and they're relatively typical of the Middle Islamic period at sites like Khabat Faris, which is not far from where we are. Um, so it's sort of an interesting phenomenon, and we're still trying to work out why it seems that the focus of settlement shifted from one area to another. For whatever reason, during the Islamic period, rather than reusing Iron Age buildings, or even building right on top of those Iron Age buildings, people seem to have settled adjacent to that Iron Age settlements, probably using some of that material, basically as building material. But they didn't build right on top of it, or at least not right on top of the main part of the settlement. Some of the Middle Islamic settlement seems to have been built on top of one of the exterior Iron Age city walls. That's something that we have to sort of work on investigating in future seasons. Um, but so we kind of know that the site is sort of interesting in that in different periods, the locus of, or the main locus of occupation is in different places. In between, there's also an area where the surface pottery primarily dates to the Roman and Byzantine periods, except there's no architecture there at all. So we're still trying to figure out the classical periods at the site a little bit. As far as the Islamic occupation, we have from surface pottery a fairly good sense, at least in broad terms, of when that occupation is primarily concentrated. So the surface pottery that we were finding, both from Wash in the Wadi near the occupation areas and from the Middle Islamic occupation areas themselves, dates primarily actually to sort of the later part of that period. So, as far as the Middle Islamic pottery, we have things that are typical of the 13th and 14th centuries, but probably more typical of the 14th century, moving into the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. And there
Well,
actually
it's a
is
Middle Islamic. You're talking about the Middle Islamic period.
middle, yeah. So probably primarily the Mamluk period, and then into
Yeah.
the early Ottoman period as well, getting into the late Islamic period. Yeah, and it's big. The village occupation is quite sizable. So Bal'ua itself is a big site. The Middle Islamic village is only a small component of that. But even that small component is much larger than other Islamic period villages that we know from the Karak Plateau. So Khabat Faris, which has been excavated, the village of Bal'ua is much, much larger than that, probably 5 times as large, something like that. The village at Lahoun, which is to the north, across Wadi Mujib. The village of Bal'ua, again, is bigger than that, and the village at Lahoun is quite large. So it's a pretty sizable occupation. Friedberg, one of the project directors, I think following on Udo Vorschek's work, thinks that Bal'ua might be the village of Shihan, which is mentioned in some Mamluk period sources, basically talking about the Hajj pilgrimage as a place where the Hajj pilgrimage passed. Um, I am a little bit less certain about that. The sources seem to indicate that the village that they're talking about called Shihan is actually closer to modern Shihan. They talk about it being on top of the mountain. Um, but it's possible, certainly, that it is the village of Shihan. It's possible that it's another named village of the period that we haven't figured out. It's possible that we just don't know the Islamic name of Bal'ua any more than we know the Iron Age name of Bal'ua. Although there, at least, we do have a guess. But yeah, still unclear exactly how it relates to historical sources. But we know that during the Islamic period, it must have been a fairly sizable village, and that's kind of the
Is it
starting
comparable?
point
Sorry,
of our project.
sorry. Is it comparable to Tel Hisban?
Um, no, and I would say, well, I guess it's comparable in the sense that I could compare it to Tel Hispan, different and arguably slightly more. So Hispan, especially during the Mamluk period, was on again and off again the capital of the Balkan, and so
Yeah,
Tel Hispan on the citadel has a lot of that administrative infrastructure that we would
of course.
expect to see at a site that was a major capital, whereas Bal'ua, well, we pretty much know what the capital of the Karak governor would always have been, which would have been Karak,
Yes.
which is of course a much bigger site, arguably even than Hispan. Um, so yeah, Hispan kind of has that additional presence. I think if we're talking about presence in historical sources, certainly from Bethany Walker's work, we know a lot more about Hispan historically than we would know about Balua. And Hispan, they they're kind of a bit luckier there in the sense that the name of the site actually does preserve both the Islamic and the ancient names of the sites, Hispan and Hespan and Heshban and Esbus and all of that. Um, as far as the size of the village, I think that Hispan is still larger. And Hispan, in some ways, in its later history, seems to have more in common probably with a site like Herbert Forest than with Balua. So one of the interesting things about both Hispan and Herbert Forest is that there are these large 19th century or very early 20th century farmhouses at both sites, generally in Arabic also called kusur, basically castles. But again, they're basically just large farmhouses at both of those sites. They're built for families that still live in the area. You can actually, in some cases, like at Herbert Forest, for example, identify who those farmhouses were built for. At Herbert Forest, it was built for Faris al-Madrali, who the site is named after. At Balua, there doesn't yet seem to be, at least as far as the remains on the surface that we've looked at, anything comparable to that, where we would have kind of this like late 19th or early 20th century
Yeah.
reuse that we can actually identify. A lot of that seems to be concentrated in places like the village of Smakia or like the villages of Qasr and Raba and those places on the plateau. So it's kind of another difference. But if we're thinking in fairly broad terms, then yes, we do start to see some similarities to Hispan. So Hispan is bigger, Hispan is more administratively important, but a lot of the domestic architecture at Hispan has parallels to the architecture that we're seeing at Balua, has parallels to the architecture that the forest project saw at Herbert Forest. Um, the organization of the village is probably not remarkably different in terms of what we seem to be seeing at Balua, and certainly what they saw at Forest was there isn't necessarily a planned village built all at once. It's a village that is built up over time, where earlier structures are remodified and reused throughout the middle and late Islamic periods. And so far from what we can tell at Balua, we've only had one excavation season in the Islamic village. That also does seem to be paralleled at Balua. And so in terms of kind of the fabric of the village, there are maybe similarities, even if Hispan has this sort of administrative layer on top. And then on the other side, Balua has some things that we wouldn't necessarily see at a village like Hispan. So one of the most striking features of the village at Balua is a really large, it's about 50 by 50 meters, square building with a courtyard right at the edge of the village. It seems to have functioned as a khan or kind of a hotel or something like that. And so well, both Hispan and Bal'ua seem to have been involved in movement of goods and people. That seems to have worked differently. So at Hispan, a lot of the evidence they have is basically that Hispan served as a center for kind of the movements of goods that were worth some amount of money. In the case of Hispan, it seems to have been a center for the distribution of sugar, just based on the presence of sugar pottery at the site. Certainly, you can't produce sugar at Hispan, so the reason that a lot
Yeah,
of it
it
would
was
be
like a
there is that,
storage place for sugar
yeah,
from the Dead Sea. But
yeah, exactly, and yeah,
yes, please. Can we reconstruct the occupation of Balua, or reconstruct the number of people who lived at certain periods at the site? Did you come to that stage, or you still have to work with your team for a couple of seasons to determine the number of people who occupied Balua in Middle Islamic period, for instance?
right. Um, So I guess there are sort of two separate answers to this. We haven't yet done estimates of the number of people who would have lived at the site during the Middle Islamic period, or during the late Islamic period. I think probably at this point we can safely assume that there might have been more people there during the Middle Islamic period than the late Islamic period. But as you say, we sort of need more work at the site to really confirm that suspicion, and also to really start doing estimates of population. We could potentially do some rough estimates now based on the survey data, but one thing that we would really like to do, and one thing your question brings up, is to get a better sense of the occupational history of the village to begin with. And that actually is one of the things that remains a pretty big question. So that might actually be a good place to sort of tell you briefly what we did during this season of excavation and what we found, and to some extent why we are having a bit of trouble still commenting to some extent on the occupational history of the village. Um, so during this season, we opened up a relatively small square. It's about 7 by 4 meters. So it's kind of a 10 by 10 grid square, but bounded by architecture. So we didn't actually open up the whole square. We left unopened the parts that extend beyond the visible architecture of the room that we were digging. So we opened this square in that structure at the edge of the village that we've identified as a Han. And we're calling that area, for lack of a better name, the Han at the moment. So
Yeah.
that's just sort of the excavation area's name. Um, and we excavated this room, and I guess I'll kind of tell you what we found, and what we need to where we need to, I guess, focus our energies to answer the questions that we have now. Um, the Han itself, we have a lot of reasons to suspect that that probably dates to the late 13th or early 14th century. And I would guess that it probably, if we had to guess, it dates to the early 14th century. One reason that we suspect that is that we know from historical sources that Han was built in Karak during that same period, during the early 14th century. Um, and so one of our guesses right now, especially just based on the form of the Han, but also based on that comparative history of the Karak Plateau, is that our Han at Bal'ua probably dates to roughly that same period. So we could place it kind of in the second half of the first century of Mamluk rule in Jordan. Kind of the what we would archaeologically call the Middle Islamic 2C, probably. Maybe late to be at the earliest. Not that those terms necessarily mean anything if you're not familiar with those archaeological terms already, but we're talking early 14th century.
Yeah.
And so when we excavated the Han, what we sort of expected to find was that we would dig down, probably find some later stuff near the surface, and then we would hit that 14th century occupation phase and get a good sense of the date of the construction of the building. What we found was a little bit more complicated than that. So we began excavating, and there's a lot of rock collapse in the building, actually more than we were expecting at first. At Bal'ua, I also probably should have mentioned this. The majority of the building material at Bal'ua is basalt. It's basalt from the Shihan Formation, which is basically a volcanic flow from Jebel Shihan during the Miocene. So as basalt in Jordan go, um, relatively recent volcanism, although in an archaeological sense, still very, very old compared, obviously, to any of the settlement of the site or to human occupation in Jordan, arguably.
Yeah.
Well, not even arguably, certainly than human occupation in Jordan. It's very heavy material, so to some extent, the salt collapse is kind of slow going. It takes a long time. Some points, or this room might have been 2 stories at some points. Either way, there's a lot of rock, and once we got below that, we uncovered a sort of remodeling of the space of the room into kind of probably a storage space or maybe even a mixed use space. So there's a central dividing wall to this room, runs right down the middle. There's a raised platform that's paved with kind of a cobble surface, basically just these small stones. Those might have been there for drainage, so possibly during some periods there were animals being stored on that higher level. Animals, well, do things that require drainage, and so cobble surfaces tend to be good for that. We found that in earlier areas of the site as well. So Stephanie Sulliver, who's the field director for an Iron Age house that we're digging in the central part of the site, has found a similar floor from the Hellenistic period from reuse of an Iron Age domestic structure. Then we sort of found these installations, one of which seems to be a grain bin that had a, well, I'll talk about that in a second, one of which seems to have been a storage for pots. But the grain bin had a fairly large amount of a cooking pot dating to the early part of the late Islamic period. I kind of wanted to find a way to say early, late Islamic that didn't sound confusing. Probably we're looking at the 16th or 17th century for this cooking pot. So that gives us a hint, although we don't yet have the radiocarbon evidence of when this reuse of that space, probably for storage, although maybe also for domestic uses, took place. And again, that's actually something that does have parallels at places like Herbert Forest. Alison McQuitty, who was the sort of one of the heads of the Forest Project, one of the main excavators of that project, interpreted some of their reuse at Forest as being not necessarily for domestic purposes, but for storage purposes by people who might actually have been living in tents outside of the buildings. And so at Bal'ua, we might have that same phenomenon where you have essentially agriculturalists, but agriculturalists who are living a sort of agro-pastoral lifestyle. They're living in tents. They're moving around a bit more than they would if they were actually living at the site. And they're using a lot of these domestic structures, or in this case, potentially not even initially a domestic structure, a structure that might have been a Han for storage purposes. We suspected going in that there would be some later reuse, probably for agricultural purposes, of the Han. because we know that on the eastern side in particular, there are these large stone circles that seem to have been threshing floors. And those would have been later than the structure itself. So we knew there would be this reuse, and we found it. We weren't able to excavate the entire room below that. That is something that we're working on for next season, or we'll be working on next season. But in a couple of probes, we did find what seems to be the original surface of the Han. It's not very far below that reuse phase, which tells us that it can't be too much older. But we don't yet have a clear sense of the date. Again, we did get radiocarbon samples from those earlier floor levels, and so we are going to try to process those hopefully soon to get a sense of what the date was. But there wasn't really any diagnostic pottery or anything that we can use to get a very precise date yet for those surfaces. And I think part of that just has to do with the amount of it that we've been able to find so far. We just don't really have enough of those surfaces to really say what date this actually is. And so that kind of complicates things, like trying to estimate the population of the village during different periods. We just don't yet have a good sense even of exactly what periods the village was occupied. Although, knowing that it was probably occupied in the 16th and 17th centuries is already pretty exciting. That's a period that is not as well known in Jordan as we would like it to be. And so that tells us that we might, at Bal'ua, be able to contribute a lot to our understanding of early Ottoman occupation. We were also hoping to excavate one of the houses this season, and just did not have time to actually open up that excavation, again, due to the sort of difficulty of excavating through all of that basalt. So that is actually the really big open question, and something that we're really interested in resolving is, how does the occupation of the village, in terms of both its date, to some extent the nature of that occupation, compare to the use that we're seeing in the Han? And I think that's when we'll really start to be able to answer the question that you have about the size of the village and how that changed over time. And it's sort of that one of those questions that we're really interested in. When do we see a very large occupation of the village? When does the size of the village seem to contract? Does the size of the village seem to contract? Obviously, we know that probably by the 19th century, if not even by the 18th century, maybe, much of the village is no longer occupied. We had a phase in the Han that dates probably to the mid or late 20th century, so quite recent, that seems to have been from just pastoral use, people passing through the site with their herds. When that started, where the use of the village was primarily as, a ruin and primarily for its fields rather than primarily for domestic occupation, again, is a question that we still have, and is, I think, an important question to answer when we think about the settlement history of the Karak Plateau. One question that we would like to know the answer to is, where do the occupants of Bal'ua go? Where are the descendants of the people who lived at the site now? For places like Herbert Forest, we actually have a pretty good answer to that question, in part because of oral histories, actually, of people who lived at the site moving to Rabba and Qasr, though primarily Qasr, I think. But we would kind of also like to get a sense of that for Bal'ua, just thinking about, okay, when is the site abandoned? What other settlements seem to pop up around that period, in combination, again, potentially with oral histories of the site. But yeah, no, I think it's a very good question. That's certainly one of the questions that we are working on answering and that we would like to answer after our next excavation season.
And for the end, I have a question. When do you plan to continue digging at Bal'ua? Because it seems like terra incognita you just started working there, and you're still guessing about the occupancy of the site, the abandonment of the site. You're trying to determine what was the cause of abandonment of the site, and whether or not the village had any kind of administrative building or buildings. How many buildings you found there so far, or can you determine the number of structures in Bal'ua, or you still have to dig, and maybe you're at the initial stage of the research in that at that site?
Those are both really good questions. Maybe I'll answer the second one first, and then come back to the first one.
Okay.
As far as the number of buildings, I actually don't know offhand. It's dozens in the Islamic village. We have a map of all of the surface architecture of the site. So it was a map that the project had started actually quite a long time ago and mostly finished in 2012. Matt Vincent and Monique Roddy did a project in 2012, mostly doing mapping of the site. So we do have a good sense of what that standing architecture looks like. And in part, our pottery dating is also based on material that was collected during those surface surveys. What's a little bit unclear still is exactly where the dividing line between where the Islamic village ends and the Iron Age occupation starts. In part because in that part of the Islamic village that's closer to the Iron Age settlement, it seems like there's rebuilding and building of new houses, I guess, on top of what are probably earlier Iron Age structures. You can kind of see that there are these smaller blocks being placed on top of much larger construction that seems more typical of the Iron Age city walls of the site. And so it's there that we kind of want to get a sense of what the occupation actually looks like before we can really say exactly how many buildings are in the village. We can certainly say dozens, though, most of them primarily houses, many of them barrel vaulted houses, and actually still well enough preserved that we could even see the beginnings of those barrel vaults starting. There's a structure also in the sort of central area of the village that seems to be a mosque. It has a feature that seems to be a qibla that points roughly toward Mecca. So that, although again, we would like to investigate that more and get a better sense of whether that actually is the case. Just from the surface, that is what it seems to be. And then, yeah, we would certainly like to excavate and see, do we have administrative structures? It's possible, do we have structures that are not domestic, but that we would expect to find in villages? So again, things like workshops, for example. Do we have something like a blacksmith shop? Wouldn't be surprising if we do, things like that. So yes, we will be coming back. Our next excavation season is planned for the summer of 2024. We generally dig from call it late June to early August, mostly for the month of July is kind of the core parts of our season. And we will be coming back. The project is generally on an every other year schedule. So the idea is we're not taking next summer off. Next summer, we will actually be conducting a study season, probably of the material from this season, so that we're able to work toward publishing that very quickly. And I think one of the really good things about the project is that we do have this schedule that we've set up with publication and dissemination of our results in mind, where we can try to do that as quickly as possible. So hopefully, even as we're doing that, we'll get a much better sense of what the material from this season actually means. But next season in 2024, we would like to open up a larger excavation area with a bigger team for the Islamic village. This was what I'm kind of thinking of as our pilot season of
Okay.
the Islamic village excavations. It was our first season, relatively small team, and to some extent, we were just trying to get a feel for what working in this part of the site is like, and a feel for the difficulties we might face. We now know that's a lot of basalt. and a feel to some extent for the occupational history of the area. And we do, as you said, we have a kind of sketchy sense of that. We're still guessing at a lot of things. But I think now, after this first season, we understand what digging in this part of the settlement is like enough that we can open up a larger area and start working on both the Han and some of these houses and potentially some other structures that we don't really know the function of as much. And I think what we would really like to start investigating soon are one thing that also makes it difficult to estimate how many buildings we have at the site is we have buildings that seem to be clusters of
Yeah.
houses. And we would certainly like to investigate those to see if we potentially can identify like shared spaces. Maybe we have family units who are building their houses next to each other at the sites. And so, yeah, we would like to get a sense of that as well. So 2024, so we'll come back.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm not very familiar with Bal'ua. I haven't been to the site, but I'm planning to pay more attention and probably prepare a couple of features about your project, especially about the Middle Islamic period. Although, as you said, and as your team proved, the site has a very long occupation from early Iron Age, which is roughly 1000 BC.
Yeah, if not earlier, and that's a question they'll hopefully be able to answer soon. But yeah, I'm glad to see more interest in the site now. The excavations were very small for a long time, and we are expanding them a lot. So I think we will very soon know a lot more about the site than we've been able to determine so far. So yeah, hopefully you'll have a lot to write about.
Thank you so much, and we'll keep in touch.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me again.
Thank you for interesting information that you disseminate, and we'll definitely talk about not only Bal'ua but other projects that you're involved in. So far, you're running 3 projects at the moment.
Yeah, something like that. It's
So
it's
you
a
have
lot, but it's
no,
fun.
you have plenty material for me. So I'm going to have you in this program and also in the paper for at least 3-4 times before you come back to Jordan in 2024. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you. I always look forward to
Bye.
it. You take care too. Bye.